On the morning Paris celebrated its triumph, France looked invincible. The bells rang, flags flooded the streets. Soldiers marched beneath balconies, heavy with flowers and applause. To the outside world, France had emerged victorious, older, wiser, bloodied perhaps, but still standing. The nation told itself a comforting story. We endured, we survived, we won. But deep inside the quiet offices of the French treasury, another truth was taking shape, one that would never be announced from a balcony, never carved into monuments, and never spoken aloud in public. France was broke, not struggling, not wounded, not temporarily strained, but structurally, catastrophically impoverished. The illusion of victory was powerful. It always is. Victory silences questions. It drowns doubt in celebration. It convinces nations that tomorrow will fix what today destroyed. Yet while the crowds filled the boulevards, clerks inside government buildings stared at columns of numbers that no longer made sense. Gold reserves had vanished. Foreign assets were gone. Debts had multiplied silently. France had not lost its wealth in one dramatic collapse. There was no single explosion, no market crash, no sudden panic. Instead, the wealth drained away slowly, methodically, like blood seeping into the soil after the battle has already ended. For centuries, France had been one of Europe's great financial powers. Its land was productive, its population vast, its culture admired. Its economy, though imperfect, was real anchored in agriculture, trade, industry, and taxation. But the modern age of war did something older conflicts never had. It turned money into ammunition, credit into survival, debt into destiny. During the war, France spent without limit, not because it was reckless, but because it had no choice. Soldiers had to be fed, factories had to run, allies had to be paid. And when tax revenue collapsed, borrowing stepped in as the substitute for reality. Borrowing from banks, borrowing from citizens, borrowing most dangerously from abroad. At first, it worked. Credit always works at the beginning. It delays pain. It disguises consequences. It allows governments to pretend that sacrifice can be postponed indefinitely. But debt, once accumulated, does not disappear with peace. It waits. By the time the guns fell silent, France had not just lost a generation of men, it had lost control of its own financial future. The nation still owned its palaces, its art, its reputation, but the wealthy, invisible foundation beneath power was already gone, and the most dangerous part, almost no one realized it yet, because France did not fall in defeat. It fell in the moment it believed the danger had passed. The war had ended, but the invoices kept arriving. They came quietly, without parades, without speeches, without drums. No crowds gathered to witness them, no flags were raised, yet these documents carried more power over France's future than any enemy army ever had. They were bills. Bills for weapons purchased on credit. Bills for food imported when fields lay abandoned. Bills for fuel, steel, machinery, and transport, everything a modern war devoured at industrial speed. During the conflict, France had relied heavily on borrowing to survive. Domestic savings were exhausted early. Taxes, already stretched to their political limit, could not cover the scale of destruction. So the government turned outward, tapping into foreign capital markets, most notably those of Britain and the United States. At the time, it felt like solidarity. In reality, it was dependence. French officials told themselves that victory would solve everything. After all, a victorious nation would rebuild, industry would recover, exports would return, growth would erase debt, just as it always had in the past. But this time was different. France had not simply borrowed money, it had borrowed in foreign currency, dollars, pounds, obligations that could not be paid back by printing francs or reshuffling internal accounts. These debts had to be repaid with real value gold exports or hard currency earned abroad. And France had very little of any of those left. Factories were damaged or destroyed. Rail networks lay in ruins. Entire regions had become graveyards rather than production centers. Even agriculture, the historical backbone of French wealth, was weakened. Fields were scarred by shelling. Livestock had vanished. Labor was scarce. The men who once worked the land now lay beneath it. Inside the Ministry of Finance, the realization began to settle in like a slow, suffocating fog. France's economy could no longer support its obligations. Gold reserves had been drained to pay for wartime imports. What remained was insufficient to reassure foreign creditors. The franc, once stable, now stood on shaky ground, propped up by confidence rather than substance. Confidence, however, is fragile, and France was about to test just how quickly it could evaporate. The government faced an impossible triangle: raise taxes and risk social unrest in a country already exhausted, cut spending and halt reconstruction, guaranteeing stagnation, or inflate the currency, silently transferring the cost of the war onto ordinary citizens. There was no painless option, only choices that delayed the inevitable reckoning. Publicly, officials spoke of renewal. Privately, they spoke of survival. Because the truth was this: France had won the war on the battlefield, but financially, it had entered a new conflict it was far less prepared to fight. A war against arithmetic, against interest, against time. And unlike soldiers, numbers do not grow tired. They do not retreat. They do not negotiate. They simply accumulate. By choosing to ignore the bill, by postponing honesty in favor of hope, France set itself on a path where wealth would no longer disappear in explosions or invasions, but in slow, irreversible transfers of power. At first, France convinced itself that nothing was truly wrong. The state still functioned, salaries were paid, markets reopened, cafes filled again with conversation and smoke. To ordinary citizens, life appeared bruised but familiar. And familiarity breeds confidence. Confidence breeds denial. Inside the halls of power, French leaders clung to a belief that had guided governments for generations. As long as the state controls its currency, it controls its destiny. It was a comforting idea, a dangerously outdated one. To manage the growing debt burden, the French government leaned heavily on monetary tools. The franc was allowed to weaken gradually, just enough to ease pressure without triggering panic. More money entered circulation. Bonds were issued. Old debts were rolled into new ones. On paper, the system appeared stable, but stability built on illusion does not last. Inflation crept in quietly. Prices rose not in dramatic spikes, but in small, persistent increments. Bread cost more. Rent edged upward. Savings lost value month by month. No single increase caused outrage, but together they hollowed out the purchasing power of an entire population. This was not accidental. Inflation was policy. By letting the currency erode, the government was effectively taxing its citizens without calling it a tax. War debts were being paid not with gold, but with diminished livelihoods. The burden was spread widely and invisibly precisely because no one would accept it openly. Yet the international world noticed. Foreign investors watched the franc weaken and began to ask uncomfortable questions. If France could not stabilize its currency, how could it honor its obligations? If it chose inflation today, what would stop it from choosing default tomorrow? Confidence once lost does not return easily. Capital began to flee. French investors moved wealth abroad. Foreign lenders demanded higher interest rates to compensate for growing risk. Each attempt to regain control only deepened the problem. The government responded with reassurance. Speeches promised discipline. Budgets claimed restraint. Committees were formed. Plans announced. But behind the rhetoric, the numbers continued their slow march in the wrong direction. France was trapped between two realities. Domestically, it needed inflation to survive. Internationally, it needed stability to be trusted. It could not have both. And then there was the political cost. Veterans returned to civilian life expecting opportunity. Instead, they found shortages, unemployment, and uncertainty. Workers saw wages lag behind prices. Farmers struggled to recover, while debts remained fixed and unforgiving. Resentment grew not loudly, not violently, but steadily. The war had demanded sacrifice. Peace, it seemed, demanded more. What made the situation especially dangerous was not merely the economic strain, but the belief among leaders that they were still in control, that this was temporary, that time was on their side. It wasn't, because wealth does not vanish when governments lose battles. It vanishes when trust erodes. And France was standing at the edge of that erosion, still calm, still composed, still unaware that the ground beneath it was already giving way. The breaking point did not arrive with panic. It arrived with routine. Exchange rates adjusted. Newspapers printed new numbers. Markets opened and closed as they always had. Yet beneath this surface normality, something fundamental was happening to France's currency and, therefore, to its wealth. The franc was bleeding, not collapsing outright, but losing strength in slow, visible increments. Each decline sent a message to the world. France was no longer anchored, it was drifting, and in finance, drift is interpreted as weakness. As the franc fell, imports became more expensive. Coal, oil, machinery resources France desperately needed to rebuild now cost more with every tick downward. Exporters, in theory, should have benefited. A weaker currency makes goods cheaper abroad. But theory assumes a healthy industrial base. France did not have one. Factories damaged by war could not suddenly scale up production. Transportation bottlenecks, strangled supply, labor shortages persisted. Even when foreign buyers showed interest, France often lacked the capacity to deliver. The currency fell, but the economy could not take advantage of it. Meanwhile, debt payments grew heavier. Foreign loans were denominated in dollars and pounds. As the franc weakened, each payment required more domestic effort to fulfill. What had once been manageable obligations turned into suffocating burdens. The state was forced into a vicious cycle. To defend the franc, it needed credibility. To gain credibility, it needed austerity. To impose austerity, it needed political stability. And political stability was already eroding. Budget cuts slowed reconstruction. Tax increases angered workers and businesses alike. Every decision satisfied one pressure only by intensifying another. The real damage, however, was psychological. Citizens began to lose faith not just in the currency, but in the future. Savings accounts stopped feeling safe. Long-term planning gave way to short-term survival. People spent quickly, invested cautiously, and trusted institutions less. This is how wealth truly disappears, not when vaults are emptied, but when behavior changes. Money that could have been invested was hoarded or moved abroad. Capital that might have modernized industry instead sought shelter in foreign currencies and assets. France was exporting not goods but confidence. And confidence, once gone, is brutally expensive to buy back. International observers took note. Creditors tightened terms. Investors hesitated. Allies, once generous, became calculating. France was no longer seen as a pillar of stability, but as a risk to be managed. The government tried to project calm. Officials insisted the situation was under control, that the franc's movements were temporary, that recovery was inevitable. But markets do not listen to reassurance. They listen to incentives, and the incentives were clear. As long as France remained trapped between debt, inflation, and political constraint, its currency would continue to weaken, and with it, the nation's real wealth. Because wealth is not measured in symbols or speeches. It is measured in what a country can build, trade, and sustain. And France was discovering too late. Those foundations had already begun to crack. The most painful loss was not measured in francs. It was measured in attention. For generations, the world had looked to France as a center of gravity, culturally, diplomatically, economically. Paris was a place where capital felt safe, where contracts meant something, where stability was assumed rather than questioned. Then, slowly, the gaze shifted. Investors began to look across the Atlantic. New York, once a secondary financial hub, now offered something France no longer could: predictability. American industry had expanded during the war. Instead of being destroyed by it, its currency was backed by vast gold reserves. Its political system, though imperfect, appeared insulated from the exhaustion gripping Europe. Capital is not sentimental. It goes where it is treated best. As France struggled to balance domestic survival with international credibility, global money chose clarity over complexity. Funds that might once have flowed into French reconstruction projects instead financed American factories, infrastructure, and innovation. London, though wounded, retained its financial networks. Paris did not. The consequences were subtle but devastating. Without foreign investment, rebuilding slowed. Without rebuilding, productivity stagnated. Without productivity, exports could not grow. And without exports, the trade imbalance deepened. France was caught in a downward spiral, fueled not by incompetence but by timing. The world had moved on. Even within Europe, competitors adapted faster. Germany, despite its own crushing burdens, restructured aggressively. Smaller nations devalued early, stabilized, and regained competitiveness. France hesitated, trapped between fear of inflation and fear of humiliation. This hesitation proved fatal. By trying to preserve its pre-war status, France ensured it could not fully embrace a post-war reality. Its leaders feared that acknowledging decline would make it permanent. Instead, denial prolonged it, and the cost was borne by ordinary people. Opportunities dwindled, wages lagged, young workers found fewer paths forward. The sense of momentums, so essential to economic renewal, evaporated. Even as cities rebuilt physically, something intangible failed to return. France had not lost its culture. It had not lost its intelligence. It had not lost its population. What it lost was the future-oriented confidence that attracts wealth. The world no longer asked, "What is France building?" It asked, "What is France trying to protect?" That question changed everything, because economies that look backward do not generate growth, they manage decline. And in the quiet recalculations of global finance, France was no longer the answer to where the next chapter would be written. The day France lost its wealth was not the day its currency fell. It was the day the world decided to stop waiting for it to recover. France eventually stabilized. The franc found a floor. Budgets balanced at least on paper. Life resumed a kind of rhythm. Cafes stayed open. Trains ran. The state endured. To later generations, it would be tempting to say that France recovered. But recovery is not the same as restoration. What France lost was not simply money. It lost position. Before the war, French wealth had been structural. It rested on influence, credibility, and the assumption that France would always matter economically. After the war, what remained was effort, without leverage work, without advantage. The rebuilding that followed was defensive, not transformative. Industries were repaired, not reinvented. Infrastructure was restored, not modernized. Capital flowed into maintaining what existed rather than creating what did not. This was not failure, was exhaustion. A country that spends its future repaying its past cannot invest fully in what comes next. The most damaging consequence of the wealth drain was time. While France struggled through stabilization, other nations surged ahead. The United States consolidated its role as the world's financial center. New production methods, new industries, and new markets formed elsewhere. France re-entered the global economy, but as a participant, not a driver. And once leadership is lost, it is rarely regained quickly. The social cost hardened as well. Inequality deepened between those connected to capital and those dependent on wages. Urban centers adapted faster than rural regions. A quiet bitterness took root among veterans, workers, and younger generations who sensed without always articulating it that something had slipped away. Not glory, not pride, but possibility. This loss shaped politics. It influenced alliances. It altered how France approached risk, reform, and power. Decisions became cautious. Policy turned inward. Stability became the primary objective, not growth. This mindset would echo for decades. When the next global crisis arrived, France would face it with fewer reserves, less flexibility, and diminished influence. The wealth lost after the war had never truly returned, had merely been replaced by survival. And survival, while admirable, does not build empires. The tragedy of France's financial collapse is not that it was inevitable, but that it was misunderstood. Leaders believed wealth was something that could be paused, preserved, and resumed once peace arrived. They were wrong. Wealth is motion. Confidence is momentum. And once interrupted, both seek new homes. France did not lose its wealth in a single day. But there was a day when the direction reversed, when capital began flowing out instead of in, when trust weakened instead of deepened, when the future stopped feeling inevitable. That was the day France lost its wealth, not to invasion, not to defeat, but to the quiet arithmetic of debt, delay, and disbelief. And that lesson remains painfully relevant, because nations do not fall when they lose wars. They fall when they confuse survival with strengthened mistake, stability for prosperity.